I found my grandfather dying in a freezing basement, his hands and feet bound with zip ties, a gag stuffed in his mouth, and a gambling debt note pinned to his chest with a message scrawled in lipstick that read, "Consider it an accident. Good luck." The temperature was below 0 and Frank's lips had turned blue. I could barely feel his pulse. That's not even the worst part. As I carried his frail 86-year-old body up the stairs, my military training kicked in and I smelled it. Gas. Heavy, unmistakable natural gas flooding through the Montana farmhouse. They hadn't just left him to freeze to death. They'd cut the gas line and were waiting for anyone to flip a light switch or strike a match. The entire house was a bomb, and my stepmother Brenda's signature was written all over it. If this story makes your blood boil like mine did, hit that like button and subscribe, because you need to hear how I made them pay for every single second of suffering they put him through. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in my situation. But let me take you back to where this nightmare really started, because you need to understand just how deep this betrayal went. I'm Harper, 28 years old, former Army Ranger, who'd just gotten out 6 months prior. Not because I wanted to, but because after 3 tours and watching too many good people die, my mind decided it had had enough. PTSD, they called it. Discharge papers, medical benefits, and a whole lot of sleepless nights is what I called it. I'd moved to Seattle trying to build some kind of normal life, working private security, and going to therapy twice a week. My grandfather Frank was the only family I had left that mattered. My mum died when I was 12, my dad checked out emotionally long before that and passed 5 years ago. Frank raised me. He taught me how to shoot, how to track, how to survive in the wilderness, and most importantly, how to stand up for myself. Then 3 years ago, everything changed. Frank at 83 and lonely married Brenda. I'd met her twice, once at the wedding where she wore a dress that cost more than my car and smiled with teeth so white and straight they looked like bathroom tiles. The second time was at Thanksgiving, where she brought her son Caleb, a 25-year-old burnout, who spent the entire dinner on his phone and disappeared twice to smoke something that definitely wasn't tobacco. I didn't like either of them, but Frank seemed happy, and after losing my grandmother 10 years earlier, I figured he deserved companionship. I should have trusted my gut. Over the next 2 years, Frank's phone calls changed. At first he'd call every Sunday like clockwork. We'd talk about the timber on his property, the elk he'd seen, the weather. His land was 300 acres of old-growth pine forest in northwest Montana, worth millions because of the timber rights alone. What I didn't know until later was that a geological survey had found rare earth deposits beneath the property, making it worth even more. Frank had always said he'd leave it to me, that it would stay in the family, that no developer would ever touch it. But the calls started getting shorter, more distant. He'd say he was tired that Brenda was calling him for dinner, that they had plans. Then the calls stopped happening every week, every 2 weeks, once a month. When I'd call him, Brenda would answer, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, saying Frank was napping or out with friends. Something felt wrong, but I was dealing with my own demons, trying to hold down a job and not wake up screaming every night. I told myself I was being paranoid. 6 months ago, I got a call from a hospital in Kalispell. Frank had fallen, they said. Broken hip. He was in surgery. I flew out the next day, but when I got there, Brenda met me in the waiting room with Caleb lurking behind her like a shadow. She told me Frank didn't want visitors, that he was tired, that the doctors said too much stimulation was bad for his recovery. I pushed back. She pushed harder, saying I was stressing him out, that I'd always been dramatic, that Frank had told her I had mental problems from the military and couldn't be trusted in a crisis. That last part hit me like a bullet. I'd shared my diagnosis with Frank in confidence during one of our last real conversations, and here was Brenda weaponizing it. I left the hospital that day feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. I tried calling Frank directly for weeks. His phone went straight to voicemail. I sent letters. No response. Brenda sent me one text. Frank needs space to heal. You're not helping. Stay away for now. For 4 months, I respected that. I hated myself for it every single day. My therapist said I was doing the right thing, giving him space, trusting the process. But the nightmares got worse. I started dreaming about Frank calling for help and me not being there. Combat flashbacks mixed with images of him alone, trapped, forgotten. My hands would shake during the day. I stopped going to therapy because I couldn't afford to look weak, couldn't afford to prove Brenda right. Then 2 weeks ago, I got a call from Frank's lawyer, a man named Ed Morrison, who'd handled the family's affairs for 30 years. He was careful with his words, but the message was clear. Frank had tried to reach out to him about changing his will, but Brenda had been present for every meeting. Ed couldn't get Frank alone. He'd noticed bruises on Frank's arms, noticed how quiet he'd become, how Brenda answered every question for him. Ed couldn't prove anything, but he was worried. He gave me one piece of advice. If you care about your grandfather, you need to come home now. Don't call ahead, just come. I packed a bag that night. I loaded my Glock 19, the one I'd carried overseas, into the glove compartment. I filled a duffel with my old military medical kit, cold weather gear, and enough supplies to camp in the wilderness if I had to. I drove 18 hours straight from Seattle to Montana, stopping only for gas and bad coffee. The further north I got, the worse the weather became. By the time I crossed into Montana, it was a full-blown blizzard, the kind where you can't see 10 feet in front of your hood, and the snow falls so thick it's like driving through static. I pulled up to the farmhouse at 11 p.m. The place was dark, except for one dim light in an upstairs window. Frank's truck was buried in snow in the driveway, no tracks, which meant no one had driven it in days. The front porch light was out. I sat in my truck for 5 minutes, engine running, watching. Something was deeply wrong. The house felt dead. I grabbed my gun, chambered around, and approached the front door using the tactical movement I'd learned in Ranger School. Stay low, check corners, minimize exposure. The front door was unlocked. That alone set off every alarm in my head. Frank was old school. He locked his doors at night every night without fail. I pushed the door open, slowly, swept left and right with my pistol. The living room was trashed, furniture overturned, broken picture frames on the floor. The glass from the windows was shattered inward, and snow had blown into the room, covering everything in a thin white layer. I cleared each room methodically. Kitchen empty, bathroom empty, Frank's bedroom empty, but the bed hadn't been slept in. The sheets were pulled off, thrown in a corner. Brenda's cosmetics were gone from the master bathroom. Caleb's room upstairs was empty too, closet doors, hanging open drawers pulled out and abandoned. They'd left in a hurry. But where was Frank? That's when I heard it, a faint thumping sound, rhythmic and desperate, coming from below, the basement. I found the door off the kitchen locked from the outside with a padlock. I shot the lock off, not caring about the noise. If anyone was still here, I wanted them to know I was armed. The basement stairs descended into darkness. I used my phone's flashlight and moved down gun first. The smell hit me halfway down. Urine, feces, the metallic scent of blood, and cold, so cold the air itself seemed to burn my lungs. At the bottom in the corner near the old furnace, I found him. Frank was lying on his side on the concrete floor, wrists zip-tied behind his back, ankles bound together, a rag shoved in his mouth and held in place with duct tape. He was wearing only his undershirt and pyjama pants, no socks, no blanket. The furnace was off. The small basement window was wide open, letting in the sub-zero air. He was shivering so violently I thought he was having a seizure. But the cruelest detail was the note. Pinned to his chest with a safety pin was a piece of paper, a printout from some online casino showing a debt of $47,000 in Brenda's name. Across the top, written in what I recognised as her lipstick, were those words, "Consider it an accident. Good luck." They'd left him here to freeze, left him to die slowly alone in the dark, and they'd made it look like he'd fallen or locked himself down here by mistake. When his body was found, they'd blame it on dementia, on an old man getting confused. The perfect crime. I dropped to my knees beside him and ripped the tape off his mouth as gently as I could. He gasped, his eyes struggling to focus. I used my knife to cut the zip ties, and his hands flopped uselessly at his sides. No circulation. His core temperature had to be dangerously low. I pulled off my jacket and wrapped it around him, rubbing his arms and legs to try to restore blood flow. From my med kit, I grabbed an emergency heat blanket and wrapped him in it. His lips were trying to form words, but nothing came out except wheezing breaths. I was about to carry him upstairs when he grabbed my wrist with what little strength he had left. His eyes went wide, terrified, and he managed one word: gas. The word hit me like ice water. I froze. I sniffed the air. He was right. Beneath the other smells, there it was. Natural gas, faint, but present, seeping into the basement from somewhere above. My mind raced through the implications in seconds. They'd cut the gas line upstairs, probably in the kitchen. The basement had been cold enough that Frank hadn't died of carbon monoxide poisoning yet, but the gas was accumulating. The moment someone upstairs flipped a light switch, used the stove, or even created a static spark, the whole house would go up. This wasn't just murder. This was insurance fraud, evidence, destruction, and covering their tracks all in one. With Frank's body burned beyond recognition and the house reduced to ashes, it would look like a tragic accident. Old man forgets to turn off the stove house, explodes, case closed. Brenda and Caleb would inherit everything, pay off her gambling debts, and sell the land to the highest bidder. I didn't waste another second. I lifted Frank in a fireman's, carry his body weighing almost nothing, 86 years old, and maybe 130 pounds. I moved up the stairs as fast as I dared, not touching any walls or light switches, barely breathing. I kicked open the back door and carried him out into the blizzard, trudging through knee-deep snow until we were 50 yards from the house. I laid him down gently and covered him with my body to shield him from the wind. That's when the kitchen exploded. A flash of orange light, a concussive boom that I felt in my chest, and the back wall of the house blew outward in a spray of wood and flame. The fire caught instantly despite the snow feeding on the gas fumes and dry timber. Within minutes, the farmhouse my great-grandfather had built in 1942 was an inferno. I held Frank close, watching everything burn, and I made a promise to him right then. I whispered it into his ear, so he could hear me over the roar of the flames. I'm going to make them pay for this, every single one of them. After the explosion, I carried Frank to my truck and cranked the heat. He was barely conscious, his body still shaking uncontrollably from the hypothermia. I needed to get him to a hospital, but I knew if I went to the local emergency room in town, word would get out immediately. In a place as small as this, everyone knew everyone, and I didn't trust anyone yet. Instead, I drove 20 minutes to a small urgent care clinic I'd passed on the way in. It was run by an older doctor named Karen Chen, who'd been treating locals for decades. Dr. Chen took one look at Frank and got to work without asking questions. IV fluids, heated blankets, oxygen. She checked his vitals and confirmed what I already knew. Severe hypothermia, dehydration, and early-stage frostbite on his fingers and toes. Another hour in that basement and he would have been dead. She said he needed to stay overnight for monitoring, but Frank, stubborn as ever, refused. He gripped my hand and shook his head. He didn't feel safe staying in one place, neither did I. Dr. Chen gave me a look that said she knew something terrible had happened, but she didn't press. She gave me warming instructions, medication for pain, and her personal cell number in case of emergency. I paid in cash, thanked her, and got Frank back in the truck. As we drove away from the clinic, Frank finally spoke, his voice rough and broken. They tried to kill me, Harper. Brenda and that worthless son of hers. They're working with someone, a man named Vance. The name meant nothing to me, but Frank continued. Over the past 6 months after he'd recovered from his hip surgery, Brenda had started bringing around this businessman. Vance Harker, a real estate developer from Missoula, with a reputation for buying up land and strip mining it for resources. He'd offered Frank $2 million for the property. Frank refused. The land was family legacy, protected forest home to wildlife. He'd rather die than sell it to someone who'd turn it into an industrial site. That's when things got bad. Brenda started pushing. She showed Frank her gambling debts, $47,000 and climbing, and begged him to reconsider. Caleb added pressure, saying he needed money for rehab, for a fresh start. Frank offered to pay off the debts from his savings if they left the land alone. Brenda agreed, but the debts kept growing. She'd take the money and go right back to the online casinos. Frank finally cut her off and said he was changing his will to leave everything to me. He was going to divorce her. That's when they made their move. 3 days ago, Caleb and 2 men Frank didn't recognise had come to the house. They'd overpowered him, tied him up and thrown him in the basement. Brenda had stood at the top of the stairs and watched. She'd told him it was nothing personal, but they needed the land. Vance had promised them a cut of the mining profits enough to set them up for life. All they had to do was wait for him to die and make it look natural. When Frank had screamed and fought, Caleb had hit him in the ribs with a baseball bat. Brenda had laughed. Listening to him tell this story, I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. It wasn't rage, not exactly. Rage is hot and impulsive. This was something colder, calculated. I'd spent years learning how to hunt people in hostile territory, how to plan operations, how to eliminate threats with precision. And now every bit of that training was pointing at one target, making sure Brenda, Caleb and Vance paid for what they'd done. But first, I needed to get Frank somewhere safe. I drove us deep into the forest, to a place I knew Frank kept a backup cabin. It was an old hunter's lodge he'd built 20 years ago off the grid, accessible only by a rough dirt road that was now buried under 2 feet of snow. I had to put my truck in 4-wheel drive and plough through drifts, but eventually we made it. The cabin was small, 1 room with a wood stove, a couple of cots and shelves stocked with canned food and supplies. No electricity, no running water, but it was warm and hidden. No one except Frank and I knew it existed. I got Frank settled by the stove with hot soup and more blankets. He fell asleep almost immediately, his body finally starting to recover. I stayed awake, watching the door, my gun in my lap. I knew what I had to do next. I needed information. I needed to know who Vance was, what his operation looked like, and where Brenda and Caleb had gone. But I also needed to test something. I needed to see if the local law enforcement was compromised. The next morning, after making sure Frank was stable, I drove into town. The place was exactly as I remembered it. 1 main street, a handful of shops, a diner, a post office, and the sheriff's office. I parked outside the sheriff's office and walked in. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley, who'd graduated high school a year after me, looked up with surprise. "Harper, oh my God, I heard about your grandpa's house. The fire department said it was a gas explosion. Is he okay?" I kept my face neutral. "He's stable. I need to speak with Sheriff Brody." She nodded and disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, Sheriff Marcus Brody walked out. He was in his 50s, balding, with a gut that hung over his belt and eyes that didn't quite meet mine. "Miss Walker, terrible thing about the fire. Your grandfather is lucky you showed up when you did. You 2 were inside." I watched him carefully. "We got out just in time. Frank's recovering. But Sheriff, I need to report something. The gas line didn't fail on its own. It was cut." Brody's expression didn't change. "Cut? That's a serious accusation. You saying someone tried to hurt Frank?" I nodded. "I'm saying someone tried to kill him, and I have evidence." That's when I saw it. The tiniest flicker in his eyes. Not surprise, not concern, something else. Calculation. He pulled out a notepad and clicked his pen. "All right, tell me everything." I gave him a version of the story, edited careful. I told him I found Frank in the basement, that the house smelled like gas, that we barely escaped. I mentioned Brenda and Caleb had left in a hurry. I didn't mention Vance. I wanted to see if Brody would bring him up. He didn't. Instead, Brody nodded along, scribbled some notes, and then said, "I'll look into it. But between you and me, Harper, your grandpa's been getting forgetful. Brenda mentioned he'd been having some confusion. It's possible he locked himself down there by accident and the gas line corroded naturally. Old houses, you know." There it was, the lie delivered smoothly. Brenda had already planted the story. Brody was repeating it. I smiled tightly. "Maybe, but I'd like you to investigate anyway." Brody assured me he would. As I stood to leave, I noticed his phone on the desk. It buzzed with a text notification. He glanced at it and his face went pale for just a second. He quickly turned the phone over, but not before I caught a glimpse of the sender's name, Vance. I walked out of that office knowing exactly what I'd suspected. Sheriff Brody was on Vance's payroll. That meant I couldn't trust the local police, couldn't rely on the justice system here. I was on my own. Worse, they now knew I was asking questions. I'd put a target on my back. I drove to the diner, next ordered coffee, and sat in a booth where I could see the street. I needed to think. My phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognise. Stop asking questions or you'll end up like Frank. This is your only warning. I stared at the text. Instead of fear, I felt something ignite inside me. They thought they could threaten me. I'd survived ambushes in Afghanistan. I'd pulled wounded soldiers out of firefights. I'd stared down insurgents who wanted me dead. Some corrupt small-town sheriff and a couple of greedy cowards didn't scare me. They'd just made a massive mistake. I spent the next 2 hours doing reconnaissance. I drove past Vance's office, a sleek building on the edge of town, with his name in gold letters. I watched people come and go. Suits, mostly. Lawyers, maybe investors. I drove past Brenda's last known address, a condo she'd rented after Frank's house burned. Her car was in the lot, a white Mercedes SUV with custom plates. I took photos, I noted times. I began building a tactical picture. That evening I found them, Brenda, Caleb and Vance all sitting together in a booth at the local bar O'Malley's. They were laughing, drinking, celebrating. Brenda's face was flushed with alcohol. Caleb looked strung out, twitchy. Vance was older, late 50s, silver hair, expensive suit. He radiated confidence, arrogance. These people thought they'd won. I walked into that bar like I owned it. Every head turned. Small towns notice strangers, and they definitely noticed local girls who left and came back looking like they'd seen war. I was wearing jeans, a black jacket, and my old combat boots. My hair was pulled back tight. I'd left my gun in the truck, but I didn't need it, not for this. I walked straight to their booth. Brenda saw me first, and her face went white. She choked on her drink. Caleb scrambled to stand up, but I was faster. I grabbed him by the back of his neck and slammed his face down onto the table hard enough to rattle their glasses. Brenda screamed. Vance started to stand, but I pointed at him. Sit. He sat. The entire bar had gone silent. I leaned down close to Brenda's ear, my hand still holding Caleb's head against the table. He was whimpering, blood running from his nose. I spoke quietly, calmly. You tried to kill him. You tied him up and left him to freeze. You cut the gas line and waited for him to die. Brenda's voice came out shrill and defensive. I don't know what you're talking about. You're crazy. Frank fell. It was an accident. I pushed Caleb's face harder into the wood. He yelped. I found the note, Brenda. Your gambling debt, your lipstick. I know about Vance. I know everything. Vance stood up slowly, his hands raised. Miss Walker, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Your grandfather and I had a business discussion, but that's all it was. Whatever Brenda and her son did has nothing to do with me. I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. That's cute. You're going to pretend you're not involved. Fine. But here's what's going to happen. I'm going to find proof. I'm going to document every single crime you've committed. And then I'm going to bury all three of you. Vance's expression shifted. The charm dropped. His eyes went cold. You're making a mistake. You're one person. I own this town. The sheriff, the mayor, half the businesses. You can't touch me. I let go of Caleb, who slumped back in his seat crying. I looked at Vance. I don't need the town. I just need you three to make one more mistake, and you will. People like you always do. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small device I'd palmed earlier from my kit. It looked like a pen, but it was a recording device. I clicked it on and tossed it onto their table. Smile for the camera. Oops, I mean audio recorder. Keep celebrating. I'll be listening. I turned and walked out. Behind me I heard Vance curse, heard Brenda shriek something about calling the police. I heard chairs scraping, but I was already out the door. I'd made my point. I'd put them on notice. More importantly, I'd rattled them. Rattled people make mistakes. As I drove back toward the cabin, my phone rang. It was Sheriff Brody. I didn't answer. He called again. Then I got a text. Harper, you need to come in. Vance filed a complaint. You assaulted Caleb. I have to bring you in for questioning. I laughed out loud. They were trying to flip the script, make me the bad guy. Fine. Let them try. I wasn't going anywhere near that sheriff's office. Instead, I drove back to the cabin, checked on Frank, who was sleeping peacefully, And then I started planning. Real planning. The kind of operation I would have run overseas. I pulled out a map of the area and marked key locations. Vance's office, Brenda's condo, Caleb's usual hangouts, the sheriff's office. I marked the roads, the forest access points, the nearest towns. Then I started thinking about leverage. What did I have? Evidence of attempted murder, but only circumstantial. A corrupt sheriff, but no proof of his connection to Vance. A recording device at their table, but I hadn't actually left one. That was a bluff to see if they'd incriminate themselves in panic. What I needed was to force them into the open. Make them come to me. And I knew exactly how to do it. They wanted Frank dead because he was the only thing standing between them and the land. So I needed to let them think Frank was vulnerable again, that I'd left him unprotected. I needed to set a trap. Over the next 2 days, I prepared. I made trips into town deliberately being seen. I asked around about Frank's lawyer, Ed Morrison, making sure people overheard. I went to the county clerk's office and requested property records loudly mentioning that I was Frank's legal heir. I wanted Vance to know I was digging, that I was a threat. Then, on the third night, I staged the bait. I drove to the clinic where Dr. Chen worked and asked her loudly in the waiting room if she could make a house call to check on Frank. I gave her the address of the old hunting cabin, making sure the receptionist heard. Then I left. I drove back to the cabin, told Frank we were moving, and took him to a motel 2 towns over under a fake name. I paid cash, made sure he was safe, and then I drove back to the cabin alone. I spent that entire night turning the area around the cabin into a defensive position. I'd learned these techniques in Afghanistan. Tripwire alarms made from fishing line and tin cans, false trails that led to dead ends, a series of noisemakers positioned in the trees to create confusion. I buried myself in a hunting blind 50 yards from the cabin entrance, with a clear line of sight, my rifle from Frank's collection loaded and ready. Then I waited. They came at 2 a.m. I heard the vehicle's first engines trying to be quiet, but still audible in the winter silence. 2 SUVs. They parked a 1/4 mile down the trail and approached on foot. I counted 5 figures through my night vision scope. Vance wasn't among them. He'd sent hired muscle. Professional, or at least semi-professional. They moved in a tactical formation, not like street thugs. Vance had money and connections. They hit the first tripwire 20 yards from the cabin. Cans rattled and they froze. One of them whispered into a radio. They thought it was an animal. They kept moving. The second tripwire triggered a branch I'd rigged to snap back and hit one of them in the chest. He yelped and went down. Now they knew something was wrong. They spread out, started scanning the trees. I lined up my shot. I wasn't going to kill anyone. Despite everything, I wasn't a murderer, but I could sure as hell scare them. I fired once a round that snapped through the air 2 feet above the nearest guy's head and splintered a tree trunk behind him. The effect was immediate. They hit the ground shouting, scrambling for cover. I fired twice more deliberately, missing, herding them back toward the trail. Then I heard it. Another engine coming from the opposite direction. A third vehicle, lights flashing, Sheriff Brody's patrol car, followed by a second cruiser. Of course, this wasn't just hired muscle, this was official. Brody was going to roll up, investigate the shots fired, and discover Frank in the cabin. Accidental shooting during a burglary, clean and neat. Except the cabin was empty. I'd left the lights on a mannequin I'd made from old clothes propped in a chair visible through the window. I watched through my scope as Brody and his deputy approached, guns drawn. The hired men melted back into the woods. Brody called out, "Frank Walker Harper, this is Sheriff Brody. Come out with your hands up." I could have shot him. Part of me wanted to, but I had a better idea. I'd set up a camera earlier hidden in the trees, recording everything. I had footage of the hired men approaching with weapons of Brody arriving not to stop them, but to coordinate with them. I had all the evidence I needed. I waited until they breached the cabin and found it empty. I waited until Brody radioed in that the place was clear. Then I moved. I hiked 2 miles through the snow to where I'd hidden my truck and drove away. By dawn, I was back at the motel, with Frank uploading the video footage to a secure cloud server. I made copies. I sent one anonymously to a reporter at the state's largest newspaper. I sent another to the FBI field office in Montana, and I kept one for myself. Then I sent a text to Vance from a burner phone. I have everything, the footage, the recordings, the proof. Meet me tomorrow at noon at the old mine entrance on Frank's land. Come alone, or I release it all. I knew he wouldn't come alone. I was counting on it. This was the endgame. The mine entrance was at the far edge of Frank's property, a played-out copper mine from the 20s that had been sealed off decades ago. It was remote, surrounded by dense forest, and most importantly it was a natural choke point. Only one way in or out by vehicle. Perfect for an ambush. I spent the morning preparing. I told Frank to stay at the motel no matter what, gave him a prepaid phone, and made him promise to call the FBI if I didn't check in by sunset. Then I drove to the mine. I arrived 3 hours early and set up. This time I wasn't playing around. I had real weapons. Frank's hunting rifles, my service pistol, flashbang grenades from my old gear I wasn't supposed to have but kept anyway. I positioned myself on high ground with a clear view of the access road. Vance arrived first, exactly at noon. He drove a black Range Rover alone as far as I could see. But I knew better. I watched through binoculars as he got out, looked around nervously. He was bait too. I scanned the tree line. There. Movement. At least 4 more people positioned in the woods, trying to be subtle. They had rifles. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an execution. I waited. Patience is what separates soldiers from civilians. You don't rush. You let the enemy commit. Vance pulled out his phone, probably to call me. I didn't answer. He waited 10 minutes, then 20. He started to look agitated. He made another call, probably to his men, asking where I was. That's when I heard the sirens. Multiple vehicles coming fast. My heart sank for a second, thinking Brody had brought backup, but then I saw the markings. FBI, state police, 3 SUVs and 2 patrol cars flooding into the clearing. Vance's face went white. His men started to scatter, but they were surrounded. Officers poured out shouting commands. I tipped them off anonymously that morning, told them where to find Vance and when. I'd sent them the video evidence, the audio files, everything. They'd moved fast because attempted murder of an elderly veteran and police corruption tend to get federal attention. I stayed hidden and watched as they arrested Vance first, forcing him to his knees. Then they rounded up his men. Then, to my satisfaction, they arrested Sheriff Brody, who'd driven up moments later expecting to help Vance cover up my murder. But they didn't get Brenda and Caleb. Not yet. Those 2 had gone to ground, probably holed up in some cheap motel. I wasn't done. I climbed down from my position and drove back to town. I knew where to find them. Caleb was predictable. Addicts always go back to their dealers. I staked out the house of a known meth dealer on the edge of town and waited. Sure enough, 6 hours later, Caleb showed up. Skinny, twitchy, desperate. I let him go inside. I let him make his buy. When he came out, I was waiting by his car. He saw me and ran. I'd expected that. I chased him down in 3 blocks, tackled him into a snowdrift. He was crying, begging, saying it was all Brenda's idea, that he didn't want to hurt Frank. I zip-tied his hands and threw him in the back of my truck. I drove him to the motel where Brenda was hiding. I'd tracked her Mercedes earlier. I knocked on the door. She answered, saw me, and tried to slam it shut. I kicked it open. She screamed. I dragged Caleb inside and threw him on the floor. Brenda tried to run for her phone. I grabbed it first. She collapsed on the bed, sobbing, mascara running down her face. "Please, Harper, please. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I was desperate. The gambling, the debts, I didn't know what else to do." I stood there looking at this woman who'd tried to kill the man who raised me. This woman who'd manipulated, stolen and betrayed. I felt nothing but cold contempt. You had a choice. You chose to murder him. Caleb was crying too, curled up on the floor. "Mom, just tell her the truth. Tell her it was Vance. He pressured us." Brenda turned on him, venomous. Shut up, you worthless little junkie. This is your fault. If you hadn't needed money for drugs, none of this would have happened." And there it was, the mask off. Even now, faced with consequences, they couldn't stop blaming each other. I pulled out my phone and called the FBI agent whose card I'd found on Vance's dashboard after his arrest. I told her where to find the other two suspects. Then I walked out, leaving them screaming at each other. 3 days later, all of them were in federal custody. Vance, Brenda, Caleb, Sheriff Brody, and 2 of the hired men who'd agreed to testify in exchange for lighter sentences. The charges were extensive. Attempted murder, conspiracy, bribery, fraud. The story made national news. Elderly veteran nearly killed by family and land scheme. I went back to the motel and brought Frank home. Not to the burned farmhouse, but to the hunting cabin which we started fixing up. Over the following weeks, as the snow began to melt and spring approached, Frank and I talked. Really talked for the first time in years. He told me how isolated he'd felt, how Brenda had slowly cut him off from friends and family, how she'd convinced him I was too damaged from the war to handle responsibility, how she'd made him doubt his own mind. I told him about my struggles, my PTSD, my fear of failure. We both apologised for the distance that had grown between us. And we made plans. Frank decided not to rebuild the farmhouse. Instead, he donated the entire property to the National Park Service, with a stipulation that it be turned into a conservation area and therapeutic retreat for veterans. No mining, no development forever protected. Brenda and Caleb took plea deals. 10 years each in federal prison. Vance got 25. Sheriff Brody got 15. The town cleaned house, elected a new sheriff, and Frank's lawyer told me I hadn't just saved one life. I'd saved an entire community's integrity. 6 months later, I sat with Frank on the porch of our rebuilt cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. He looked at me, healthy and strong again, eyes clear. "You saved my life, Harper. But more than that, you taught me it's never too late to fight back." I thought about the Harper who'd driven up here broken and doubting herself, the one who'd sat paralysed in that Seattle apartment letting people convince her she was too damaged to matter. That Harper was dead. In her place was someone who understood that the people who claim to love you can be the ones who hurt you most. Someone who knew that fighting back isn't cruel, it's survival. Here's what I learned. You don't owe anyone your suffering. Not family, not guilt, not some twisted idea of loyalty. When someone shows they're willing to destroy you for their own gain, believe them the first time. Trust that sick feeling in your gut when someone treats you like an obstacle instead of a person. And know this, your trauma doesn't make you weak. Your scars don't disqualify you. Sometimes the very things that broke you are what make you unbreakable. So I want to know, have you ever ignored your instincts because you felt obligated to give someone another chance? Have you sacrificed yourself for someone who'd never do the same? What would you do if the people you trusted most betrayed you in the worst way possible? Drop your answer in the comments. If this story hit home, smash that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear that walking away from toxic people isn't wrong. It's necessary, even when it's family. Especially when it's family. Stay strong out there.